Several of you might, like me, enjoy listening to podcasts every now and then. And at the moment, with the Feeding Britain podcast channel, we're uploading a series of conversations with 10 local food partnerships who set up the Feeding Britain network 10 years ago. And we just reflect with them on some of the big challenges, yes, but also ideas and programmes that we've dealt with over the years in different parts of the country. And if it's okay with all of you, I'm just going to use these next 15 to 20 minutes to reflect with you from a national level at some of those big challenges, ideas and programmes that I've witnessed and been involved in over that 10-year period. And perhaps if there's any time left, if I don't ramble on for too long, we can have a bit of a wider conversation in a similar vein here in Eastbourne. But what I'll do to kick off with is read through something that I actually was reading on the train down here, on the long train down here from Newcastle, which I think sets the scene rather appropriately. In the past 10 years, our perceptions of food banks have changed dramatically. First seen by policymakers and the general public as an emergency, short-term and caring response to what was supposed to be a time-limited hunger problem, they are now viewed, at least implicitly and often reluctantly, as one of the cornerstones of society's anti-hunger and anti-poverty strategy. Although there is much talk about eliminating the need for them, concrete strategies to effect such an outcome remain elusive. Unfortunately, anti-poverty community agencies have also had difficulty articulating, given their current realities, an evolutionary transition strategy that policymakers could find acceptable and take action on. I think given what Jess said earlier, that sounds pretty much right as a summary of our current situation. Well, that wasn't written in 2024 in Britain. That was written in 1994 in Toronto about the then situation in Canada. Now, fast forward 30 years from 1994 to today, you'll see very frequent social media appeals from the food bank movement in Canada and across America for urgent stock donations, emergency winter programmes and the like. Some of you might also have seen that with the Trust Food Bank network, we're starting to see on an annual or biannual basis emergency appeals, urgent donations for stock. And when I have these comments in mind and I think about these biannual or annual appeals from the Trust Food Bank movement these days, I think, my goodness, if we're not careful, we in Britain could end up institutionalising both food banks themselves and the need for food banks on this industrial scale like what we now see in Canada and America. So that's the sentiment I'll have in mind throughout the remainder of my remarks. But 10 years ago, I'd just begun working in the House of Commons for an MP called Frank Field, who represented the shipbuilding town of Birkenhead up in Merseyside. And I joined his office with a programme of work around the living wage, as was touched upon earlier, and how we can improve the life chances of poorer children and so on. But nowhere in my programme of work was there hunger, destitution, or food banks, which I'd only heard of in passing. Within a week or two of my joining Frank's office, in the postbag came a report from Rural Food Bank, which covers Birkenhead. And the headline of it was clear. What was this tiny trickle of people coming through the doors for our help, and a food parcel, and a loving arm around the shoulder to tide them over a short period of difficulty, we now have a steady stream of people in these circumstances, and it ain't just acute crises, it's often more chronic food poverty that we're responding to. And if things don't change, that steady trickle is going to become a mass flood. So very shortly after reading that report, the colour drained from Frank's face, and this was a new item for my programme of work. How could we respond to this destitution that was now emerging in Birkenhead? So we visited the food bank, and the first person that I witnessed there receiving her food parcel, the look on her face taunted me and it would never leave me. There was this sense of defeat, and shame, of having hit rock bottom, and the idea that she was being witnessed in her hour of need by these strangers. I say it haunted me and it troubles me to this day. And from that point on, I thought there is no way that we in Birkenhead as a town, let alone we as a country, the United Kingdom, could tolerate this scenario this shame, this sense of hitting rock bottom for a growing army of people who were destitute. On the back of that visit and a bit of research, we wrote to the then Prime Minister David Cameron to say, Prime Minister, there's something going terribly wrong at the bottom of our society, and we think it's a public inquiry needed to find out what on earth has driven this, what's causing this, and as importantly, what can we do about it? We went up to 10 Downing Street to see the inner Cameron circle, and they, how can I put it politely, they rejected our request for a public inquiry. So as Frank and I walked back out the other end of Downing Street with our tails between our legs, he said, right, we'll have to set up a parliamentary inquiry if the executive's not interested. So we assembled an all-party group of MPs and peers who weren't interested in political point scoring, because there was a lot of that going on in the House of Commons at the time. Mud being slung from one side of the chamber to the other, it's your fault, no, it's your fault, all of that business. These were MPs and peers that, like us, who are interested in finding out seriously what's gone wrong here and what can we do about it. And we ran an inquiry along those all-party lines throughout 2014, and the report of that inquiry was called Feeding Britain. In that report were 77 recommendations for how our country could respond to this destitution. Many of those, as you can imagine, were directed at 9 government departments, but there were also hatfuls of ideas around how we could reform community food provision, how we could reform grassroots practice to give ourselves a fighting chance of making good food more affordable and accessible for people on lower incomes, and in the process reduce at least some of the need for food banks. So the MPs and peers are scratching their heads thinking, how can we get this going in our constituencies? We'd better set up a charity, and that's where Feeding Britain came from. And so in the 10 years since Feeding Britain was born, we as a charity have really proposed, I'd say, 3 broad programmes of work. The first of those I dwelt upon in this morning's session was how we could respond adequately to what was put rather crudely as holiday hunger among children and young people. In other words, that gap in provision and support that exists out of term time. Because what the food banks had showed us were these monthly breakdowns of referrals for crisis food parcels, and every time we hit the school holiday, the graph and the bars just went like that. It was like looking at the great mountain range. And the summer holiday was like looking at Mount Everest on this mountain range. So we thought we've got to do something differently here. So we trialled a programme of fun and food, deliberately in that order, offered along universal lines in mainly poorer areas, families where parents were both in and out of work, where when the schools weren't sitting, the kids knew they were going to have a great time, the parents knew the kids were going to have a great time and be in a safe space, but we knew they were going to have at least one, more often than not 2, nutritious meals on site and probably a doggy bag to take home for dinner. Had we badged it as a food programme, I doubt we'd have seen so many children take it up. In Birkenhead in that first summer alone, we had 2,000 children come through the doors.
Good.
Perhaps not surprisingly, in retrospect, once we began in earnest to roll out this programme of fun and food in the holidays, food banks started saying to us, well, actually, not been as busy this summer holiday. The teachers are saying, do you know what? The kids are coming back better behaved, settling in more quickly, with stories to tell their mates about what they've been up to in the holidays, and clearly they're well nourished. Whereas in previous years, it used to take at least 6 weeks for those kids to catch up because they've been hungry, they had nothing to do. So we rolled this out across Feeding Britain, and given we were set up by that all-party group, we thought, well, we can't just have it one-way traffic of them telling communities what to do. We want communities to feed back into them what needs to change with policy. So on the back of those early fun and food programmes, we drafted what was called the School Holiday Activities and Meals Bill that attracted cross-party support from 130 MPs in the House of Commons. And it was at that time, do you remember when Theresa May had that minority government? So she needed the support of the Democratic Unionist Party to form a functioning government. So we knew that as long as we had just enough Conservative backbenchers and DUP backbenchers supporting this bill, we had a fighting chance of getting the government to act. In response to that campaign, the government did act, and they introduced what we now know as the Holiday Activities and Food Programme across the whole of England, supporting 750,000 children every year in the holidays, with £200 million a year behind it. We're currently running another campaign in Parliament, as I said earlier, to get that funding renewed beyond of this year when it runs out. So that was one Feeding Britain campaign. Interestingly, it was great to hear Joe talking about what the town was doing, because we found that particularly for teenagers and secondary age young people, your community-based, church hall-based provision, which works brilliantly for younger children and primary age children, isn't perhaps the most appropriate or popular form of support. So we've actually got those teenagers being able to take their half budgets out to cultural and sporting and other activities and services in their locality and being able to access that. So a theme I'll have throughout the remainder of my remarks really kicks off here. Here we have a programme built around good food that enhances that sense of freedom and choice and dignity and autonomy for people who were previously denied those qualities of life. A second programme of work owed itself to another of those early food bank conversations, where these staff and volunteers of such goodwill and compassion and ingenuity said, you know what, Andrew, it's no good because we have people coming through our doors on a Friday. We get to know them and we ask what's gone wrong, why have you had to seek a food parcel? And they'll tell us after a while what has gone wrong. We might be able to mention to them a service or an agency that they can access for wider support to address that underlying cause of hunger. We might be able to give them a leaflet with some more details on of these services and agencies. Do you know what? In some cases, we might even make a phone call to get them an appointment at the right service or agency. And yet they come back the following Friday, and the Friday after that, and the Friday after that. So I said, why can't we actually, as opposed to sending people halfway across town, taking 2 buses that they can ill afford to get there, to get this extra advice and support that will mean they've got more money in their pocket, or they've dealt with that underlying issue with their housing or utilities or council tax that's left them hungry. Why can't we bring those services here so that the moment somebody opens up to us about what's gone wrong, we can immediately introduce them to that person who can make the right phone call, fill in the right form, or speak to the right person to get that issue resolved. So this was another Feeding Britain project. We called it Pathways from Poverty. How could you co-locate services around food? In effect, you could call it an early cash first project, because we were concerned about getting more money in people's pockets, reducing outgoings, so they no longer had to come back to their food bank. We tried it and it worked. We supported 7,000 households through that intervention, £4 million plus every year as a direct benefit to their incomes. And surprisingly, very few of them had to come back to food banks after that. But what's been interesting, I'd say, in the past year or two, is that beyond those kind of traditional advice agencies like Citizens Advice or Independent Advice, who we've commissioned to come into food banks, public services have actually had the penny drop. So we've had local authorities, for example, think, hang on a minute, we often have very acute crisis level interventions around evictions, homelessness, safeguarding, etc. If we can actually co-locate some of our staff into food banks where we can serve the underserved, reach the, to use a horrible phrase, hard to reach, we can solve their problems early enough that we save ourselves much costlier interventions further down the line. That's that self-interested altruism that I was talking about this morning. So there's a great number of councils now looking at how they can co-locate staff within food banks and some of those affordable food clubs that I'm talking about in a moment. And secondly, we're now seeing health agencies who are thinking again, we've got these underserved areas, the hard to reach, where all the data shows health inequalities are at their most unjust, life expectancy is at its lowest. If we can send some of our light touch screening services out to the food banks and the food projects, and again, pick up signs of trouble at an early enough stage, we can fast track people for treatment and prevent at least some of the risk of chronic ill health and disease further down the line. The third, and I think dominant area of our work, owes itself to that experience I touched upon at the beginning, of the look on the woman's face at the food bank in Birkenhead of having hit rock bottom and having to accept a bag of pre-packed food that had been given to her because she had told them she was destitute. We thought, how could we develop a tier of provision on that second rung of the food ladder, about which we heard this morning, that sits between your crisis level food banks and then your bigger retailers and bigger food programmes. So we thought we would develop, I'm going to use the catch-all term here of food clubs, but that can encompass your larders, your pantries, your social supermarkets, any kind of community-based model where people make a contribution And in return for that contribution, they've got a choice of goods they can take home with them. And that choice of goods isn't confined to tins, jars and packets. It includes fresh, chilled, frozen, as well as household goods. So it really feels like a genuine shopping experience. Since opening up the first of what we call the social supermarkets in Birkenhead in 2018, across Feeding Britain we've gone on to support 400 of those food clubs across the UK, with a collective membership of 90,000 households containing about 250,000 people. And what's interesting is that 5 years ago, I think practically everyone in Eastbourne, and certainly across the country, knew what a food bank was. We all had seen them, many of us had visited them, a great number of people had had to rely upon them, and we're all aware of how they worked. But I'd say 5 years ago, hardly anyone knew what a food club was, whether they existed, how they worked, whether you could actually access them. What's particularly striking is that we now have official data showing that last year, more people across the country accessed a food club than had to use a food bank. And up in Merseyside, where Feeding Britain began, for every one person who still sadly has to use a food bank, more than 2 people are now accessing a food club. Why is that significant? We've just surveyed a few thousand people that access food clubs, just to begin to get an idea of what ripple effects there might be associated with accessing this form of support. Now, I'm not very good at remembering numbers, so you have to bear with me for a moment because I don't want to mislead you. From this survey, 98% of people said that coming to a food club had improved their access to affordable fruit and veg. 75% had said that as a result of coming to the food club, they were now eating more fresh fruit and veg each week. 98% said they were now able to afford to eat more balanced meals since coming to the food club. 71% said they were now cooking more balanced meals at home since coming to the food club. 74% of people said they could now report improvements in their well-being as a result of coming to the food club, and that was particularly strong, by the way, for people who had the most severe risk of food insecurity and those who tended to visit more frequently. So the greater your access to the food club and use of it, the stronger these improvements were likely to have been in your well-being. 63% of people said that they had accessed a wider range of services and activities as a result of coming to the food club, and of those, half said specifically they'd accessed financial support at the food club to resolve that benefit problem, get their debts under control, and in any case get more money in their pockets. And finally, almost half of people said that they had a reduced need for food banks as a result of attending the food club. Among the other half, there was a big group of people who hadn't had to use a food bank at all before, and therefore the food club had truly acted as a preventative service. But there was still a minority of people whose circumstances are so desperate, they are having to use both food banks and food clubs to survive from week to week. And I think therefore that speaks to the fact that food clubs can form one important layer of what needs to be a multi-layered strategy if we are to end the need for food banks and ensure that everyone can access and afford good food. But I do think it was Susie Leather, around the time this report in Canada was written, that said, you know what, richer people have always been able to buy their autonomy and freedom. Community food provision can give that autonomy and freedom to poorer people. And I think with the holiday work, with those wraparound services, and with the food clubs, we're beginning to see how that hands greater freedom to people who've been denied it for so much of their life. And talking to people at food clubs who were previously using food banks, probably in that group of half I just mentioned, they say, Andrew, I've always got a little bit of money in my pocket at the end of the week. I'm very rarely completely skint. It's not often I don't have 2 halfpennies to rub together. I've always got something, but it just never feels quite enough to go to Aldi or Lidl or Asda and still not fall far behind on my rent, or still not fear about having money to put in the meter. And so in those circumstances, I don't have choice, I don't have freedom, I have to use a food bank to survive. Now that the food club is open and on my doorstep, I've got the choice. I've got a freedom from hunger, a freedom from that fear of not being able to top up the meter, that freedom from the fear of falling too far behind on my rent and I get evicted. I've got the freedom to choose from this range of goods what I'm going to have for dinner for these next few days. and I've got the dignity of actually buying it. I've got the dignity of being a paying customer, of being a member, and not that indignity of having to be given a bag of tins, jars and packets by a complete stranger. So I really do think, looking back at those 10 years, we have begun to turn the tide through community food provision on this inevitability of just having more and more people having to ask for more and more food parcels from more and more food banks. But I will just close by saying that I really hope we can rely on Josh as a good friend to take into Parliament some of these ideas around workers' rights and having a proper wage for a proper day's work, having a fairer, more efficient benefit system, having that stronger nutritional safety net around the take-up rates of, the coverage of, and the quality of free school meals, holiday provision, and healthy starts. And what I want to say is that it's a blessing that for the past 7 years, our Feeding Leicester partnership has been chaired by a local MP called Liz Kendall. Some of you may have seen Liz Kendall is now the Secretary of State for Work and Pensions, overseeing the welfare state. Liz called me in the middle of the general election campaign to say, Andrew, look at our manifesto. I've got in there a commitment to end the mass dependence on food parcels. 2 weeks after the election, Liz called a small group of us into her office at the DWP. So I've made this commitment. I now need your help if we're going to honour that commitment. So I want to think that when it comes to reforms to benefit assessments, benefit deductions, benefit sanctions, let alone benefit levels, we'll have a very good friend now. But Liz has also spoken about how we can both bolster that national minimum income, below which we don't allow anybody to fall in hard times, but also getting these place-based and community food approaches right, so we can help people build off that minimum and make life, yes, more bearable and manageable, but also more enjoyable for people, just as we've seen in that wonderful video. Now, going back to this Canadian paper, there was a line to say the present government promised to take the actions necessary to eliminate the need for food banks within the term of their current mandate. But upon reflecting on the fiscal dilemmas and political pressures facing them, they determined that such an objective was impossible to accomplish within 4 years. Now let's hope that just as with community food provision, we're forging a different path to the Canadians and Americans, that on the policy front as well, we can forge that different path so that the next time we're all together, I can rip up this paper and say, thank God we didn't do what they did. But in the meantime, thank you again for challenging us and inspiring us in the way you have. And I'd love to take any questions or get your reflections for those of you who might be involved with larders and other projects. That's a part of the reason why I suggested to Josh earlier that we have a backbench bill around the mandatory reporting of food waste further up the supply chain, to get the sense that the food is still there, but we've got to get it redistributed in a much better way than we're doing now. My hope / assumption at the time, 6 years ago, when we opened up our first social supermarket, was that all the food we would ever need for this kind of programme would come from surplus and donated goods. You know, there was oceans of this stuff sloshing around, and we just needed to get our sticky fingers on it and put it to good use. I'd say that broadly held true for about 2 or 3 years. Over these past 2 or 3 years, though, I have noticed a big shift. On the supply side, as you've just described, it is becoming harder to get our sticky fingers on the surpluses in the system. But on the demand side as well, particularly from 22 onwards, when our fuel bills went through the roof, families coming to food clubs now actually tend to bring a shopping list, and they want to fill up at least 3 bags to take home with them, because this is going to be their big shop for the week. Whereas in the olden days, maybe it's a bit of a top-up shop for lots of people, and a bit of a bonus to tide them over the weekend. And that's forced us at Feeding Britain to rethink those initial hopes and assumptions. And I'm probably influenced by lineage here. My mum grew up in a pit village in the southwest of Scotland, where the very first food cooperative opened in our country in the she'll kill me if I get this wrong, I want to say the 1770s or thereabouts. So cooperatives and cooperation is in there somewhere. My nan worked for the co-op in the East End of London, all of that. And we're thinking, okay, given that growing number of people coming to access food clubs, if we could combine their collective purchasing power and take it to wholesalers, to markets, to farmers, etc., and negotiate a favourable deal that doesn't leave them out of pocket, that enables us to pass on substantially enough savings to people in the estates and neighbourhoods and communities that are served by food clubs, are we not in some way breathing new life into those old cooperative ideals? And we've been fortunate to work with a group of people in Norfolk who have spent their whole lives in and around the food industry, and they've got contact books to match. They're now starting to negotiate on our behalf with dairies, with farmers, with butchers, and with ambient wholesalers, so that we can form the bulk or the core of the supply chain for food clubs now from non-surplus, so we can guarantee our shoppers and members each week that core basic range of goods on the shelves. The beauty of that is then we can add to that with surplus and donated goods to mix things up a bit, because we still feel duty bound to prevent food going to waste if we can. Of course we do. But whereas we were at a stage where people would wait for their surplus or donated delivery to come in, take stock of what was on the pallet or was what not on the pallet, and then panic buy from the supermarket to fill up the shelf of the food club. Let's try and flip that on its head, so you can guarantee the core from non-surplus and add to it the surplus and donated goods. And I think I want to think it's becoming a bit of a virtuous circle, because we found that those food clubs that have embraced that model are saying actually families are now happy to spend a little bit more of their hard-earned money with us. They'll spend £10 or £15 every time they visit. That's giving us a more buoyant revenue base to reinvest in our stock. We can employ someone at £15 an hour to give them a properly paid job to run the show, and so it goes on. So I think I know I asked you about what the next 10 years could look like. I think over these next 10 years we'll see more food clubs go down that more blended supply route of surplus and non-surplus. It's remarkable that over the past 18 months to 2 years, we've begun working with close to 100 food banks who want to convert into a food club, like a social supermarket.
Yeah.
So I think, whereas before that it was mainly community groups responding to challenges in their area and from the beginning wanting to be a food club, more recently it's actually the food banks wanting to convert. Or if they can't convert fully into a food club, they might add on a food club to supplement their crisis provision. Say we just don't have the resource or the space to do it ourselves. Could we actually have these referral vouchers with money tied to them?
Yeah.
So that after someone's had their first big parcel from us, we can then give them this voucher to redeem at the nearest food club, and that voucher can give them a month's worth of free shopping or whatever it might be. So you're right, I do detect within the food bank movement there's a real determination to embrace and support the food club model.
Yeah, it's the shame and stigma that comes with the current food bank system that trying to shift away from perhaps that's more of an answer.
Well, just as I was shaped by that initial experience in Birkenhead, there was one food club we launched in Essex at the beginning of last year in Jaywick, and I got talking to a group of pensioners at the front door who were signing up for membership on that first day. They said, you know what, mate, we've got no big supermarkets here, so we can't access the choice, the variety, the bargains and all the rest of it, so we're missing out on that. We have one local shopkeeper, and he knows he can charge what he likes because he's the only show in town, and the stuff he's got is of poor quality, really. You'll never find us at the food bank. Oh no, we're not a charity case.
Yeah, I've experienced that.
Stay with this food club, come with our mates, you can pay an affordable fee, great quality, we can fill our own baskets in the way we want, and we can all have a good old gossip while we're here. I think it removed any risk of shame or stigma that could come with a food bank. And by the way, that is notwithstanding the love and the care that food bank staff and volunteers show.
Definitely.
That struck me from day one. They really do put that loving arm around the shoulder of people in their hour of greatest need. But it is just that very fact of thinking, I need this referral because I'm hit rock bottom, I'm of missing defeat, and as a result of that, I've got to be given this bag of tins, half of which I don't know whether I'll even eat or like. It's really struck me. The short answer is I don't know, but I'd jolly well love to know. It sounds fascinating.
Yes.
Is there anything online where I can read about the Eastbourne system?
Well, I mean, the Eastbourne system is just put it in the bin, isn't it? But on the Isle of Wight, there's quite a complex system. But I'm happy to share details.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And just interestingly, our most recent partner of what is now 120 local partners within Feeding Britain is with the Isle of Wight.
Well, that's why I came today. We're about to form our food partnership. Yeah.
Brilliant.
So I
We're
want
gonna
to
support-
learn from all the amazing stuff everyone's doing here.
Absolutely.
So we do some things that you're not doing, and you're definitely doing loads of things that we would love to be doing. So
Brilliant. Well, we're going to try and get the infrastructure in place to support 9 or it might be 10 food clubs across the Isle of Wight now.
yeah, we've got plenty of food pantries. So you're probably in touch with Emma.
Monique.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Right.
We'll see you kind of the team later.
Okay. I've got to go, but
I've been reading
I
your
will
time.
be in touch.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andrew.